So, in addition to the differences in pressure, breathing is also dependent upon the contraction and relaxation of muscle fibers of both the diaphragm and the thorax. The lungs themselves are passive during breathing, meaning that they're not involved in creating the movement that helps inspiration and expiration. This is because of the adhesive nature of that pleural fluid, once again, which allows the lungs to be pulled outward when the thoracic wall moves during inspiration. The recoil of the thoracic wall during expiration causes the compression of the lungs. So the lungs getting smaller is helping this expiration. Contraction and relaxation of the diaphragm and intercostal muscles cause most of the pressure changes that result in inspiration and expiration. And these muscle movements and subsequent pressure changes cause air to either rush in or be forced out of the lungs. So that is what is referred to as lung recoil or elasticity. There is also surface tension within the alveoli, and this is caused by water being present in the lining of the alveoli. This surface tension tends to inhibit expansion of the alveoli, but the alveoli have this type 2 alveoli cell lining their cells, and it produces this pulmonary surfactant, and it helps mix with the water and reduce this surface tension. Without pulmonary surfactant, the alveoli would collapse during expiration. And then one last physical factor affecting ventilation is what we call thoracic wall compliance, which is the ability of this thoracic wall to stretch while under pressure. So this can also affect the effort expended in the process of breathing. And in order for inspiration to occur, the thoracic cavity has to expand. Well, this expansion of the thoracic cavity directly influences the capacity of the lungs to expand. If the tissues of the thoracic wall aren't compliant, it will be too difficult to expand the thorax to increase the size of the lung. So they need to be compliant with expansion, basically. So here we can get a close-up of the gas exchange center of the lungs and the alveoli. So the lining of the alveoli are elastic fibers mostly. So that's what we see here. These are mostly just like elastic fibers. But these help enable them to expand during the inspiration and recoil during expiration. But the respiratory membrane is an area of the alveoli, so it's right here. This is an area of the alveoli that is characterized by simple squamous epithelia. Okay, so we have this alveolar epithelium and the capillary epithelium that makes up this respiratory membrane. And between them is this fused basement membrane. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here, these three membranes that make up this one respiratory membrane. This is all simple squamous epithelia. This is a very thin layer of epithelia, and it allows ease of diffusion. So in this scenario, we're transporting carbon dioxide into the alveoli from the capillary, and oxygen into the blood from the alveoli, or into the capillary, I should say. And so this helps, again, supply tissues with oxygen that they need and get rid of the carbon dioxide that was a waste product of cellular respiration. Also, before we move on, there's actually some good pictures here when it comes to the surfactant releasing cell. This is that type 2 alveolar cell, helps release surfactant in the alveoli to prevent its collapse. And then we also have a macrophage in there as well, chomping up different pathogens that, for whatever reason, were able to make it past the hostility of the trachea and the ciliated mucus. So, now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of respiration itself. So we've talked about ventilation and how we got air into the body, and now we need to talk about how oxygen and carbon dioxide are actually transported. And they're not really transported, they're diffused. So they're moving into and out of tissues based on pressure gradients. And so that's what this PO2 and PCO2 signify, is just pressure. So we're talking about the pressure of oxygen or the pressure of carbon dioxide. And so the pressure of oxygen is always going to be moving down its gradient. Same thing with carbon dioxide, down its gradient. So pressure of oxygen is moving from air into the alveoli, or I'm sorry, air in the alveoli into the blood. And so there's more oxygen in the alveoli than in the blood, so it just moves down its gradient. Same thing when we are moving from the blood in our tissue capillaries into the tissues. So these are two different processes where we're moving oxygen down its concentration gradient or pressure gradient. Same thing happens with carbon dioxide. We're moving from tissues into the blood in tissue capillaries. So we'll also move carbon dioxide from blood in the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli. And so this is a nice summary slide talking about pressure of oxygen and pressure of carbon dioxide. But now we can talk about the actual nitty-gritty of this diffusion. So we have internal and external respiration, referring to the processes of where they are occurring. So external respiration is simple diffusion that occurs in the lungs. So that's where we are at when we're talking about external respiration. You can think of this as the internal environment of your body making contact with something that is external, because that air has made its way through a continuous tube, a passageway, down to the lungs and the alveoli in the lungs to make contact with this epithelia and transfer oxygen into the blood and receive carbon dioxide from the blood. So it's almost like an environment within your body that has been untapped or uncontrolled for, even though we trapped some pathogens along the way and whatnot. So external, you're dealing with the external environment here. Whereas internal respiration will be doing with stuff like in your tissues and your blood. So it's all within you. So in external respiration, the alveoli has a high oxygen partial pressure and a low carbon dioxide partial pressure due to ventilation. That ventilation brought oxygen in from the outside environment, and it didn't bring as much carbon dioxide in as it did oxygen. Oxygen makes up a larger proportion of our atmospheric pressures than carbon dioxide does. So we brought a bunch of oxygen in, and there's less carbon dioxide in the alveolus than outside. And so blood has a low pressure or partial pressure of oxygen and a high pressure of oxygen, or this should say CO2, I'm sorry. I'll make sure I correct that. High pressure of CO2 due to cellular respiration in tissues. And so there's a lot going on here. We'll break it down slowly once we get there. But for right now, just understand that oxygen is higher quantity in the alveoli of the lungs because we breathed it in. And then it moves by diffusion down its gradient into the blood where there's less oxygen present. Same thing with carbon dioxide. As a product of cellular respiration in our tissues, it was produced, and then we have less of it in the alveoli, so it moves down its gradient, down its pressure gradient, into the alveolus where it can be expired. And I just drew this in here. This is our respiratory membrane that we just talked about on 2 slides ago here. So internal respiration is the gas exchange that occurs at the level of body tissues. Similar to external respiration, internal respiration also occurs as simple diffusion due to a partial pressure gradient. However, the partial pressure gradients are opposite of those present at the respiratory membrane. The partial pressure of oxygen in tissues is low because oxygen is continuously used for cellular respiration. In contrast, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is high, coming from the lungs, which creates a pressure gradient that causes oxygen to dissociate from hemoglobin, which we'll get to in a moment, diffuse out of the blood, cross the interstitial space, and enter the tissue. Hemoglobin, that has very little oxygen bound to it, loses much of its brightness, so that blood returning to the heart is more of a burgundy color. So that's why it's got a different color than oxygenated blood. Considering that cellular respiration continuously produces carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is lower in the blood than it is in the tissue, causing carbon dioxide to diffuse out of the tissue, cross the interstitial fluid, and enter the blood. That's exactly what we see here. This tissue used cellular respiration and produced carbon dioxide as a byproduct, goes into the interstitial fluid, and then subsequently into the blood plasma down its pressure gradient. It's then carried back to the lungs, either bound to hemoglobin, dissolved in plasma, or even in a converted form, which we'll get to shortly. By the time that the blood returns to the heart, the partial pressure of oxygen has returned to a lower amount, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide has returned to a higher amount. So the blood is then pumped back to the lungs to be oxygenated once again during external respiration. Everything that we're talking about with external and internal respiration is gases diffusing down their gradient. So if you can just remember, cellular respiration needs oxygen to work and then produces carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Just remember that. You'll know what you're talking about when you're talking about internal and external respiration and which way carbon dioxide and oxygen should move. So oxygen is transported in the blood, but it is not very soluble in liquids. When we're talking about the transport of oxygen in blood, a small amount does dissolve in the blood and is transported in the bloodstream, but it's only about 1.5% in our plasma. The majority of oxygen molecules are carried from the lungs to the body's tissues via erythrocytes, which contain hemoglobin. I think 92% of erythrocyte proteins are hemoglobin themselves. So hemoglobin serves to bind oxygen molecules to the erythrocyte. Heme is the actual point of oxygen binding. And so this is one heme here, and in the center is that iron. And the iron is where the oxygen is drawn to of this heme. Each hemoglobin molecule contains 4 iron-containing heme molecules. 1, 2, 3, 4. And because of this, one hemoglobin molecule is capable of carrying 4 oxygen molecules. As oxygen diffuses across the respiratory membrane from the alveolus to the capillary, it also diffuses into the red blood cell and then is bound to hemoglobin. This reversible reaction describes the production of the final product of hemoglobin and oxygen reacting together, which is oxyhemoglobin. Pretty straightforward, oxygen and hemoglobin together, oxyhemoglobin. This is formed when oxygen binds to hemoglobin. This is an incredibly bright red molecule, and it contributes to the bright red color of oxygenated blood. This oxygen can then be used by tissues for cellular respiration to provide energy.